Hello and welcome to the next mini lecture on supporting evidence. We will split this lecture into two parts, approximately 5 minutes apiece. And this time we will stick closer to 5 minutes than I said in the last lecture. Well, in a previous session, we discussed audience analysis. We discussed why it's important to research our audience in that it lets us know what their interests and needs are. We can also start to go beyond basic assumptions and begin to understand specific audience beliefs, attitudes, and values. We also discussed the various types of audience analysis: direct audience analysis, indirect audience analysis, and demographic audience analysis. But what if I were to ask you if audience analysis and evidence are related? In other words, in performing audience analysis, is it possible that we use some of our findings as potential evidence? For example, what if you decided to survey an audience about their views on Fantasy Fest? And in your survey, you might even discover that 90% of the local folks dislike Fantasy Fest. Yes, that's right, the local folks dislike it. As a matter of fact, they rate the top three reasons they dislike it as an increase in traffic, an increase in crime, and an increase in unacceptable social behavior. Intrigued by your findings, you decide to interview the mayor of Key West, and the mayor echoes citizen concerns but points out that Fantasy Fest accounts for a huge portion of the city's annual revenue, some 25%. He echoes the fact that it accounts also for a quarter of all local revenue. That means that local business gets an additional 25% as well. Now, the mayor directs us towards talking to a couple of businesses. Let's call them Business XYZ and Business ABC for our purpose. And the owner of Business ABC is more than happy to talk to us about stories related to Fantasy Fest. After all, ABC is the first part, and they've been there, so they know what it's like. And ABC tells us how nervous business owners were when it first started, and Fantasy Fest, what's this going to be all about? And there were many nervous business owners who wanted to kill it, but ABC tells us that after the initial Fantasy Fest, they were delighted about the amount of money they were making and wished that it would continue in perpetuity. Now, the mayor also directs us to talk to the Key West Chamber of Commerce. And when we speak to the president of the Chamber of Commerce, he notes that Fantasy Fest is also vital to local business. He points out that there are sister communities around the nation that have similar festivals, although I can't imagine anyone similar to Fantasy Fest, who also report some citizen concerns, but who also report that these type of festivals are vital to the local economy. So I've just recounted several examples of basically direct and indirect audience analysis. And in our analysis, we've discovered some facts and some statistics, some examples, some stories, and some testimony about the importance of Fantasy Fest to Key West. Now let's circle back to the initial question that I asked. Is there a relationship between audience analysis and evidence? And I think we can come up with a resounding yes, which we will explore further in part 2 of this mini lecture.